Greetings, boglobs and gut munchers, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
In the immortal words of Sonya Blade from the hit TV show Mortal Kombat Defenders of the Realm, it's combat time. Weapon skill 14.
Outside of their mainline systems, over the decades Games Workshop have produced many other games within the Warhammer universes. Sometimes these were short-lived, and in some cases we're pretty sure people only ever bought them for the models and never actually played them. I refuse to believe anyone has actually played Renegade. If you say you have, then you are lying. But some, like Space Hulk or Blood Bowl, have had multiple editions that span over many years. However, there's one game that's not talked about much despite the fact it's had 4 editions from 1989 to 2017, and even has a 2019 video game adaptation.
Yes, today we are talking about Citadel combat cards.
The 1989 version, specifically.
Now, there have been many card games made using the Warhammer licenses, but this one has a couple of distinctions. One is that it's always been produced by Games Workshop themselves, and most of the other Warhammer card games, the ones people remember anyway, were made by third parties or subsidiaries. The other thing is that they use pictures of miniatures on the cards rather than any unique artwork. So although that does mean we're being robbed of a deck full of Rogue Trader era artwork, we do get to see a wide range of old miniatures spanning both Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Warhammer 40,000.
Citadel Combat Cards was designed by Jervis Johnson, based on his observation that kids were really into collectible card games, and should GW make one, it'd be an excellent intro into Warhammer for them. So regardless of what some people might say, GW catering to kids isn't exactly a new phenomenon. They likely just didn't notice it was happening at the time since they were literal children. Although it was intended for the cards to also serve as an invaluable painting guide for older players too. The first edition of the game was announced in late 1988 and came out around April in 1989, costing £1.50 to buy a single deck of 35 cards. There weren't any boosters or anything, so you didn't have to go through the whole rigmarole of buying booster packs, and then getting more and more annoyed at the amount of star use you owned. Each deck was more than enough to play a game with, although you could use different decks against each other if you so desired. Also, perhaps uniquely considering the type of games we cover in this series, this is a simple enough game that we can read the entirety of the base game's rules to you in the video, because it's basically top trumps.
How to play Citadel combat cards. Any number of players can play combat cards. Deal out the combat cards to the players. Each player should hold their combat cards in a face-down stack. The player who owns the pack takes the top card from their hand and places it face up on the table, and then picks one of the statistics: weapon skill, strength, speed, bravery, toughness, or intelligence. Each of the other players then place their top combat card on the table, and the card that has the highest value for the characteristic chosen wins the round. All the other players' combat cards are killed and put to one side, and the card that won is returned to the bottom of the owning player's stack. The player to the left of the player who went first now takes a turn, as above. In the case of a draw, all the combat cards that can't match the chosen player's characteristic are killed, and the remaining cards are returned to the player's hands. The last player to hold any combat cards is the winner of the game. So yeah, the basic idea is that you pick the statistic you think you'll have the highest in, and that's really it for strategy. So it's not the deepest game by any means, but it's quick and simple to play. In fact, you can play through a full game with a single deck in about 10 minutes. Also, I know it says it's suitable for any number of players, but you get like 36 people playing and you're gonna run out of cards, so checkmate. Games Workshop?
Where exactly are you going to find 35 other people who want to play combat cards?
That's not the point.
There were 6 decks released in the first edition: Chaos, Dwarves, Goblinoids, Monsters, Space War, and Warriors, 3 of which we can show you now, partially thanks to a kind viewer called Rich who sent 2 of these decks in to us, so thank you very much, Rich. Taking a look at the cards themselves, they show a painted Citadel miniature with an attached series of stats. There's also a few symbols at the bottom, but we'll get to those later. And although there were some with generic names like Marsh Troll, most had proper names too. Coming up with them was, according to Jervis Johnson, one of the biggest challenges of making the decks in fact, considering the sheer amount of cards in that first run. Some highlights are Gerda von Evilstein, Boglob, Gut Muncher, and Brother Skull. Not to be confused with the Rogue Trader mini, Brother A Skull, although in my Rogue Trader Coffee Shop AU fanfiction, they are cousins.
Some other cards of note are Father Reuben Morris, who's a chaplain without a skull helmet, but they've made him a teeny tiny book. Lieutenant Commander Chavez, since he's a Blood Angel in camo colours, and this Zote. Just because when a Zote shows up, you are legally obligated to mention them. Also, despite each deck having a theme, you do get a little crossover. So, although the Chaos deck contains multiple Chaos Marines, there's also one in the Space War deck, and although the Monsters deck contains multiple demons, there's also some in the Chaos deck. They also didn't always stick entirely to one game. So whilst the Space War deck is all 40k, the Chaos one has stuff from both fantasy and 40k, and the Monsters deck, despite being nearly entirely fantasy, also contains an Amble. Although, fun fact, there was an article in White Dwarf 108 that contained a crossover adventure for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in which Ambles do show up.
The Space War deck also prominently featured squats, and we mention this because they're one of the most requested things for us to do a video on, but since they never had a dedicated book like a Codex and the information on them is scattered throughout many other books and magazines, they're not the most natural fit for the series. Maybe we'll find a way to do something with them in the future, but for now, just know that we do always make a point of mentioning them when they show up. Now, I know that we said that the decks were 35 cards, but that's not wholly accurate. They came with a 36th card that was not to be used in the game itself. It was a cover card so the decks looked nice in their packaging, and on the other side it had rules. Sometimes these were rules for the base game, but often they were rules for bonus games. The decks we have came with rules for Deadly Doubles, Imposter, and All or Nothing.
Deadly Doubles required two identical decks, and you'd lay them face down and take turns trying to find the doubles. Basically, it's that memory match game that you've probably all played a million times before. Imposter is a play on the card game Cheat, where you must place cards face down declaring what they are, and it's up to the other players to call you out on your possible mistruths. If it's anything like Cheat, it'd be a fun game. You get to find out which of your friends and family are compulsive liars. And All or Nothing is a variant on the base game, but played alone. You lose the game if you get a single card killed, and win if you beat half the deck you're not using, hence All or Nothing. I'd call it roguelike solitaire, but that description is probably best kept for another old GW card game.
As you can see, many of these bonus games, just like the base game itself, were just adapted versions of existing card games, but it did add some other ways of using the cards. However, that wasn't all. It was suggested, rather strongly, to Jervis Johnson that he write additional games for the cards to be printed in White Dwarf, and so in 1989, issues 114 and 115 came with rules for the games Attack and Charge respectively. In Attack you mount the cards upright, either with blue tack or using a base. They recommend the ones used in Talisman, but we're using the door bases from Space Crusade here. Each player gets 16 cards, picks one as a general, and you place them on a chessboard facing away from your opponent. The players then take turns to move and attack enemy cards adjacent to them. The way cards attack is actually very similar to how modern 40k wounds work, with the opponent getting to strike back too. So yeah, the first person to kill another player's general wins. There were even rules for an expanded 4-player version too.
And that's not even mentioning the optional rules, like terrain or the use of special abilities. Remember those symbols at the bottom of the cards? Well, the special abilities were one of the things that they could be used for. Grymox here was a fearsome monster, so an opponent fighting him must make a bravery roll first. Molin, Lord of Skull... Shouldn't that be Skulls? Oh no, that's actually what it says, fair enough. Molin, Lord of Skull, could make a ranged attack. And cards like Alan the Seer were a wizard or a psyker, so you could make your opponent reveal one of their cards for 5 seconds.
In the other game, Charge, you use the cards as character sheets for a skirmish game. That's a sneaky way of trying to incentivize you buying the models on the cards there, G-dubs. This game is way too in-depth to go into full detail on, since it's basically a really stripped-down version of doing a dungeon in D&D, with the symbols on the cards relating to abilities and alignments. The example scenario, Lethal Lairs, uses one of the dungeon floor plans GW put out for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is something we didn't even realise they made until reading this article, if we're honest. There's even a guide on how they generated the stats for the cards, giving you the ability to make your own. So, with some time and effort, and a bit of fudging to account for the differences in modern stats, it's totally possible to make cards, or even a whole deck of your own modern models, which we would never do because that would just be a gross waste of our time.
I suppose you're also wondering about the other editions of the game too.
Well, the second edition of Citadel combat cards came out in 1995. It had 5 different decks, this time including models from 2 more game systems, Man of War and Epic. Epic we've mentioned here before, but Man of War, for those unaware, is like Warhammer, but with boats. It's cool. The third edition came out in 1999 and had 8 decks, half of them from Fantasy and half from 40k. This edition had an entirely new set of rules where each card had a number and a colour. You had to play a set of cards that were all the same colour as a warband, and whoever's warband total up to the highest number wins the round. The cards from this edition are also the least visually interesting, at least in our opinion. They're just a bit...
There was then a bit of a gap, but in 2017 a 4th edition was released that had a completely retooled rule set and only featured models from 40k. It took the simple top trumps format from the earlier editions, combined it with the warband idea from the 3rd edition, and sprinkled it with additional synergies and abilities to make something new. Whilst not super complex, it's still the most complicated version of the game, not counting those old White Dwarf articles. The 4th edition was further elaborated on for a free-to-play mobile adaptation from 2019, developed by Well Played Games. Although the Citadel part has been dropped from the title, so it's Warhammer Combat Cards now. It's not a bad little time waster, honestly. It has many of the downsides of a free-to-play mobile game, of course, but they're not as egregious as they could be, so yeah, it's fine. It's alright. Although a nice little thing we discovered is that on the game's website they have some unofficial expansion rules for the 4th edition of the physical card game, stated to be inspired by those old White Dwarf expansions from 1989.
So that was Citadel Combat Cards, a neat little game with a surprisingly long legacy. Also, we'd like to put out a formal apology to anybody who went and watched any episodes of Mortal Kombat Defenders of the Realm after we mentioned it in the intro, because it's not very good. Okay, yeah, we're very sorry. Okay, bye.